Yeah, the design slides will be there like in like 10 minutes or so. Yeah, but we're gonna start off with the programming section first. So yeah, you can follow the slides for the programming lecture. Okay, so today we're gonna cover how JavaScript, how you can use JavaScript to interact with HTML and CSS. Specifically, we're going to cover some really useful functions that you'll be using in your homework and lab assignments. So this lecture is going to be a little on the heavier side in terms of coding. So just be prepared to like follow along with the slides throughout the lecture. So first, some announcements. Homework 7 that should be tonight. So homework 7 is due tonight at 7 p.m. And homework 8 will be released tonight. And then some reminders about the final project. So make sure to read the spec and get a head start on it, since check-in will be due on April 15th, which I believe is next Thursday. And then the actual project is due on Tuesday, April 27th at 11:59 p.m. And if you want to view some inspirations from past semesters, you can look at our showcase website and you can see like from all the previous semesters what students have done for their final project, and then maybe that'll inspire you to think about what you want to do for your final project. And then the submission link is at wdd.io/go/project submit. And as always, if you need help on homework, labs, or the final project, please come to office hours or ask via Piazza or go to the link wdd.io/go/oh. And then finally, if you have any anonymous feedback for us, please submit them as well at wdd.io/go/feedback. So here's our rough agenda for today. So first, we're going to review some basic concepts related to variables and functions in JavaScript. And then we'll walk over a new concept, which is objects in JavaScript. And then we're going to cover how to use JavaScript to manipulate the DOM, which stands for the document object model. And then finally, we're going to see how we can use JavaScript to manipulate CSS styles. So first, variables and function review. So in our last week's lecture, we covered variables, and variables are basically like the variables that you see in math, where you declare them and you assign them a certain value. And this value can be a string, in which case it will be put into quotation marks, such as let name equal Asia, or it can be a number, such as let age equal 21. And remember that in JavaScript, you should end each statement with a semicolon to let the code know that you're done with like writing that line of code. And yeah, the syntax is, again, you use let to let JavaScript know that you're creating a variable, and then you put the name after, and then the equal sign, and then whatever value you're assigning to it. Here's a kind of like reminder of what not to do in JavaScript. So here you see there's let age equals 20 plus 5. And in the second line, you're like subtracting 2.5 from age. This is incorrect because it doesn't know like where you're storing the value for age minus 2.5. And because it doesn't know where you store the value, like basically you're just like typing it into the void, like nothing's going to happen to it. So this is incorrect syntax. If you want to store the actual value into a variable, you should do what the green highlighted line says. So you would do age equals age times 2. So that basically says that like if you have age equals 25 and you want to multiply by 2, you do 25 times 2 and then assign that value, which is 50, to the variable age. So just remember when you modify a variable to like reassign that value to either the same variable or a completely different variable. But yeah, if you only do like age minus 2.5, like that's not going to work because the value is just like lost in the void forever and it's not stored anywhere. Another review about functions. So this is the syntax for functions in JavaScript. So you have the function definition, which is where you like actually specify like what the function does, what it's called, and any like things that you want to do within the function. And then you have the function calling, which is like how you actually apply the function to like whatever parameter you want to call it. So for the function definition, you have the keyword function and then the name, which in this case is show greeting. And then within the parentheses, you have the parameters that you want to pass in. So here we have name as a parameter. So we know that whenever you call the function show greeting, you want to pass in a string that will take the variable name. And then you can do like whatever you want to the variable name and then like return a value, for example. So here we're doing let greeting equals howdy plus name plus exclamation mark. So that does like a string concatenation with the variable. And then it basically alerts that like greeting string in your browser. So remember when you're using functions that you have to have both the function definition and the function calling. So if you only have the function definition and you don't ever call the function, then it's basically useless. And if you call the function without actually defining it, then you're basically like calling a function that doesn't exist, and that will throw an error. Yeah, and then the return value in a function basically means that you're like returning the final output value to whatever like previous line of code you have in your file. So for example, here you have function square x and you want to return x times x. So when you call the function square on like a number such as 5, it'll return the value 25. So after you call the function square, it'll assign the value 25 to the variable y. So if you don't have return in your function, it's not going to know like what to return after you call square. So like the y variable will essentially have nothing. So you want to make sure that you are returning a function, or sorry, returning a value inside the function. And in terms of passing the parameters, it doesn't have to be like the actual value. So it doesn't have to be like a number. It can also be another variable. So for example, in the last line, we have let z equals square y. So you're passing in the variable y into the square function. So you don't have to say like, oh, like you pass in like 25. You can just say like y instead. Okay. Any questions so far about like the review for variables and functions in JavaScript? Okay, moving on to the next new concept, which is objects. Oh, someone asked, what's the difference between return and alert? So return is like, I guess like alert and console log are like functions where you can see the visible output directly in your browser. So like alert is basically when you see like that popover come up in your browser. And then console.log is like when you see the printed output in your console when you do like inspect element. But return is different in terms of like, you're not like, a lot of times like you might not see the output directly like in your browser. And you usually use it to, I guess, like assign it to another variable or like do something else with that value. So return is something that's like a lot more versatile, I would say. Like alert and console.log is just like, oh, you want to verify that like you're doing the right thing. But return is like, I guess, a lot more useful in terms of like assigning you variables and like keeping the values like throughout the functions that you call. Is there a difference between this and this? Oh, so you mean like the quotation marks? There's no difference between using double quotation marks and single quotation marks, as far as I know in JavaScript. So they would both be treated as strings. Although I know some languages, like if you use a single quotation mark, that means it's a character rather than a string. But I think in JavaScript, if you use the two interchangeably, it's completely fine. Okay, moving on to objects. So before we move on to describing like how we use JavaScript to manipulate the HTML and CSS, we first need to cover an important concept, which is objects. So basically, when we write code, we're trying to convert the world and how we describe it into English and into a representation that computers can understand. And so far, we've talked about like numbers and strings, but what if we want something a lot more complicated? So for example, if we want to describe a car or describe a house, like how do we do that, right? Like we can't just say a house equals a number or a house equals a string. So that's where objects come in with JavaScript. So objects are essentially, by definition, like JavaScript's way of representing more complex things. And they are a collection of methods, which are functions, and then properties, which are variables. So for example, we have a car. What are the properties of a car? There's color, model, and the current miles per hour. And in terms of functions that a car can do, it can drive straight, it can brake, it can also, well, it can't actually change color, but like if you were to like repaint your car, like that would be like changing the color of your car. So yeah, basically you can think of objects as a collection of methods, which are functions, and then properties, which are variables, and together, like those functions and variables describe that object. So let's get more into like how we represent this into in code. So for example, on the property side, we have like color, model, and MPH. Color and model are represented as strings, and then we have MPH, which is a number. And then for functions, we have 3 functions. They are basically named like exactly what the function is. So like drive straight, brake, or change color. So when you define an object in JavaScript, it'll basically look like the code on the right side. So again, you want to use the let keyword to define the variable. And then on the other side of the equal sign, you have a curly braces. And then within the curly braces, you have all of these properties and functions. So this is a bit different from like typical, I guess, like other values in JavaScript, like numbers and strings. Here, you have to use curly braces to indicate that this is an object. If you've done like other programming languages before, this is very similar to a dictionary. So yeah, you have the properties, which are color, model, and MPH. And you see here that like when we define the value or the variable car, we already give it like a certain color, a certain model, and a certain MPH. And then inside the car object, we also define these functions for driving straight, braking, and changing color. So depending on, I guess, like what you want to do with a specific car, you can like define specific functions for each of these like methods that you have. So yeah, this is how you define an object in JavaScript. So remember to use curly braces to indicate that everything is kind of like in like one item. So you're assigning that entire value to the variable. A question in the chat, why are we not using let color equals red here for properties? Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess you use let for like defining an entire variable. And here, the entire variable is the object. So you're not defining the individual properties within the object, you're just defining the entire variable itself. So that's why you don't use let for like color or model or like any of the functions inside. So you can think of like, I guess the functions as kind of properties as well, in terms of like you're assigning the value or like you're assigning the function to a property that's called drive straight. So yeah, this is just the syntax of how you create objects in JavaScript. So you don't use let for the properties and the functions within the object. What if you had break number? How would that change the function signature? Yeah, so that's a little more complicated. Like, I guess you're getting into like function signatures, but I guess like the way you define the function is really up to you. So like if every single car object that you want to make has these properties and functions, you don't necessarily like, I guess you don't necessarily need to make them all have the exact same signatures. Like I think if you, as long as you know that like, oh, if you have a car that has a break function with a parameter and then another car that has a break function without a parameter, just like make sure that when you're calling the break function for those 2 different cars that you know that one of them accepts a parameter inside and the other one doesn't. But I think generally when you're creating objects in JavaScript, like it's best to make them all the same. So like if every single drive straight function does not have a parameter, then like do that for like all the cars that you create. So yeah, that just ensures that like everything's consistent and you don't make mistakes when you're trying to call a function. Okay, Yeah, so this is a lot of new syntax, so don't worry about like the like nitty-gritty details of this. Just remember that like when you're defining the variable, you use the curly braces to indicate that it is an object. And then within the curly braces, you assign like the property and the value. And you can think of like the functions as like properties as well, since you're using like the colon syntax. Moving on to dot notation. So now that we created an object in JavaScript, how do we get the property or the function of that object? So that's where dot notation comes in. So on the left, you see here we have the car from before, and we want to, for example, get the color of the car. So how do we do that? One, we can use like console.log to verify that the color is indeed red. So we would use dot notation to say car.color, and that would return the string red. So yeah, it's like pretty straightforward in terms of the dot notation. Like all you do is just put a dot in between the variable name and then the property that you want to retrieve from that object. And then similarly, you do the same for the functions as well. So like you do dot notation with car and drive straight. And remember, since it's a function, you have to call it with parentheses at the end. And so, yeah, this line basically just calls the drive straight function from this object that is called car. And then finally, the last example is essentially the same, except you're passing in a parameter this time. So you're using dot notation again to change the color to blue. Yeah, so I guess you can just think of it as like you use dot notation to get any like properties or functions from the object. And then if it's a function, you just put like parentheses and then whatever parameter you want to pass in. Are there any questions so far about the like how you declare an object in JS and how you use dot notation to retrieve the properties and the functions? Okay, if not, we'll move on to how we can use JavaScript to manipulate the HTML page. So how do HTML and JavaScript meet? Let's first look at this example here on the slide. We have an index.html file, and then within that HTML file, we have this very simple like web page. Basically, we have like an H1 title at the top, and then we have an unordered list of items. So if we were to kind of decompose this into a diagram, we would see that at the very top, we have the entire document. And then within the document, we have a body. And inside the body, we have two direct child elements, which are H1 and the UL, the unordered list. And then the UL has individual LI elements. So in terms of the DOM, which I don't think we've ever covered specifically yet, DOM stands for Document Object Model. So when the HTML page is loaded, JavaScript creates its own representation of the page, which is made up of objects. So each HTML tag is essentially an object. So this is the reason why we taught you guys like what an object is in JavaScript, because it's really important to understand what objects are in order to understand how we can use the document object model. So here we can see that document has many functions, and two of the most useful functions that you will use in this class are getElementById and getElementsByClassName. And then document also has a property called title, which you can also change and manipulate with JavaScript. And then in terms of the body element in HTML, it has several properties such as class list, inner HTML, style, and children. And there's a lot more properties as well, but for the purpose of this class, these are like the four most commonly used properties. And then similarly for H1 and the unordered list, we also have like very similar properties such as class list, inner HTML, and style. And for unordered list, because we have like list items inside the list, we have the children property as well. Yeah, these are, again, like only a few out of like 100 different functions and properties that belong to each of these elements. But since we really only use like a few of them for this class. Like these are the only ones that you guys are like responsible for knowing for this class. Yeah, so our first focus is going to be on the getElementById function. So what is this function doing exactly? It essentially takes one argument, a string, which is the ID of the HTML element we want, and then it returns the element object. So let's go into detail about how this really works. So for example, here we have a line that says let list element equals document.getElementById, and when we pass in the string food list. So the string food list represents the ID of the element that we want to select. So as you can see here, we have the UL food list element, and then within that we have the 4 properties as we mentioned before. So when you do let list element equals document.getElementById on food list, it essentially returns this entire HTML element with all of the list elements inside of it, and it assigns that value to the variable list element. Yeah, so this might seem like a lot to you guys, but we'll go into a demo later on to show exactly how this works. Yeah, and since the document.getElementById function returns an object in HTML, you can use dot notation to get the properties and the functions for that object that you returned. So for example, here, if we want to get the property class list, we use dot notation on food list to get that class list, and then we can print it to the console. So in this case, class list is basically just an array or a list of classes. So in this case, if you notice from the HTML that we had before, we have a class equals blue box attribute on this UL element. So when we try to use dot notation to get the property class list, it returns the array with the string blue box. So that means that the food list element has the class blue box. And if you have multiple classes with the food list, then it will return like multiple string values in this array. Likewise, you can use dot notation to get the inner HTML of that specific element, and that basically returns like a string format of the children that are inside this element. So the unordered list has like 3 different like list elements inside of it, and so when you do inner HTML on that, you essentially just get all of those like list elements and then return that as like an entire string. Yeah, so this is kind of a little wrong. There should be like a quotation mark at the end, but yeah, if you like try this in your browser, it'll return like a complete string of all the children elements inside the element that you're trying to call inner HTML on. Oh wait, never mind. We do close it with the ending quotation mark. But yeah, this is what would happen if you do inner HTML. And then finally, we have children. So if we use dot notation to get the children property, it will return all of the children elements inside this current element. So like 3 different li elements. So why are we doing this again? So recall some of our examples of interactive features from the last lecture. For example, if we want to implement behavior where like a user clicks on an image and it increases the size of that image. So that would change like the CSS width property of that image. And another example is if a user clicks on a button, we want to change the colors to dark mode. So changing colors to dark mode essentially means you're changing the CSS color and the background color. So how do we convert these to code? We basically use document.getElementById first to retrieve the object from the DOM, and then we can like get the property of that object and manipulate it to change it to whatever we want it to be. So for example, if we have a button that has the ID dark mode button, we can retrieve that from the DOM and then change the CSS of that button. And we'll cover this shortly in the next few slides. Before that, we'll go into another method that's really useful. It's very similar to getElementById, except it's called query selector. And yeah, it basically kind of works the same exact way. It also takes an argument, which is a string, which is the CSS selector of the HTML element we want. So while we want to use the ID for .get or document.getElementById, for a query selector, we want to use the entire selector. So like if you want to get something via the ID, you have to say hashtag the ID name. Or if you want to get something via the class, and then you have to say dot the class name. Whereas getElementById is just like the name of the ID. And it's a little bit different from getElementById in the sense that it returns the very first element object that matches the selector name. So if you have like multiple elements with the same like class, and if you like use query selector on that class name, it'll only return the very first one that comes up in your HTML. It won't return like all of them at once. So that's also a bit different from document.getElementById. But usually when you use the two, it's pretty similar. So yeah, we just want to like cover both in this lecture. So yeah, let's go into an example about how this document.querySelector function works. So as you can probably notice on the slide here, like instead of saying food list by itself, we have a hashtag in front of it. That's because like query selector, like it doesn't take an ID name specifically. It needs like that entire selector. So you need to pass in the hashtag. And if food list was like a class name, you would have to use the period in front. Yeah, so this is essentially doing the exact same thing as document.getElementById on food list. It also returns the entire object. And within that object, you have like these properties that are shown on the slide here. There's another way to use document.querySelector that does not rely on using classes or IDs. And this is probably one of the bigger advantages of using query selector over getElementById, because with getElementById, you're kind of restricted to using IDs to select elements, but here you can use like anything. So like you can use IDs, you can use classes, and you can use the tag itself. So here, if you want to get the unordered list, you can just pass in UL as the string instead of using the ID or the class of the list. And this will essentially return the exact same thing because this is the only unordered list that we have. And just to show kind of like the difference between using document.getElementById and query selector, like here we have multiple different div elements and they each have the class child. So when you do let element equals document.querySelector on .child, it only returns the very first element. So this variable element is now the first child div, and any changes to element will only change this very first div element. So it will have no effect on the second one because query selector only selects the very first element that it finds. Yeah, and then now we'll go into a short demo to demonstrate like how we use these two functions. And I will switch over to another page. Okay, I'm just gonna share my entire desktop because it's easier to show you guys like the code and everything at once. Okay. Hopefully you guys can see everything. So I essentially copied over the code that we had on the slide here. So we have, if I inspect element, we have like the H1 title at the top, and then we have an unordered list with all of these list elements inside of it. And as you can see, it has like the exact same ID and class names as covered in the slides. Okay, so we can first go into console and then try out the document.getElementById function. So let's just say, okay, let's say we want to get the food list item or the food list unordered list. So we can do let food list. So one thing that's really helpful in the console is that it gives like suggestions as to what you want to like autocomplete for like the properties. So as you can see here, like there's a lot of different properties and functions, and you definitely don't need to know all of them. So For the purposes of this class, you'll probably only use like several of them, I would say. And today we're just going to cover like one of the functions, which is getElementById. Okay, so if we do getElementById, remember that since it's already like getElementById, we only need to pass in the string value of that ID name. So we don't have to use hashtags or periods or anything. We can just say directly food list. Okay, so here we've defined a variable called food list, and we've assigned the variable of this object that is returned by selecting the element with the ID food list. And so if we just enter food list here, we can see that it represents this entire DOM object that we've retrieved from the HTML. And okay, so that's like how you would do it with getElementById. What about document.querySelector? So it's pretty similar. We can do it like several different ways. So we can do document.querySelector, and then here we can either use the class or the ID. So let's just use the ID first, since that's like unique to the list. So we use hashtag food list, and then actually let me assign this to another name, like food list 2 or something. Okay, so now we have food list 2, and it's basically, it should be the same as what we had before. So yeah, if we print out food list 2 in the console, it's the exact same output as we saw before when we used document.getElementById. And then another way to do this is using the class name. So we have document.querySelector, and then we can use the class name, which I believe should be blue box. Yeah. And here we use the dot or like the period notation to indicate that it's a class. And let me make this food list 3. Yeah, so when you print out food list 3, again, it should be the exact same output as before. Since there's only one like food list, or there's only one blue box list, so it returns only that one. And if you have like several other ones, it would only return like the very first element that it finds that has the class blue box. But here, since we only have like one list with blue box, it only returns that one. Okay, so now we've kind of seen like what happens when you use these two functions. Let's try getting the property or a function of that element. So since food list 2, and food list 3 are all the same, I'm just going to use food list for simplicity purposes. So let's see what kind of properties food list has. So as you can see, there's a lot of properties, and you won't be using all of them. But the ones we want to show right now are class list, inner HTML, and then I think children. Yeah. Okay, so let's try. Where is it? Let's try class list first. Yeah, so when we press enter, it returns a DOM token list. Don't worry about like what that means. It just like know that it's a list of values. So here you can see that since we only have one class that's called blue box, it returns that in a list. And then what if we wanted to do food list dot inner HTML? So as we saw on the slides, it returns like a complete string of all of the children elements within the food list element. So here we see that there's 3 separate li elements, and then it basically like mushes all of them together into one entire string. So that's what inner HTML does. And then finally we have, what's it called? Children. Yeah, we have children, which returns an HTML collection, which essentially just treat it as a list of like separate elements. So like, yeah, this returns a list of li elements, and you can see here if you expand it, they are each like individual objects. So this is like a list of separate DOM objects that you have in this food list. I think there was another property. Oh, there's style. Okay. Yeah, we can use style to see what that returns. Okay, so when we use dot notation and get the property style, we see that it returns a CSS style declaration, which again, there's just like a lot of fancy names for like different things, but like this is just an object that contains properties that are essentially the same as like CSS properties. So as you can see here, like it basically lists all of the different style like CSS properties that you would see normally in like CSS, except most of them are like blank because obviously we didn't assign any values to those properties. Let me minimize this because it's kind of long. Okay, so yeah, we've covered how to get element by ID and how to use the query selector function. And then also we covered how to use dot notation to retrieve certain properties from that object. Are there any questions about the demo or anything that we've covered so far? Okay, if not, we'll move on to the next section in the lecture. Oh, I see a question. Oh, never mind. Okay. Yeah, so lastly, we'll cover how to add and remove CSS classes with JavaScript. So in JavaScript, we have objects and those objects have properties, but those properties can also have properties within them. So it turns out that the result of foodlist.classlist is not just a list, but also another object. So now our code kind of looks like this. So we have document.getElementById on foodlist, and then we try to retrieve the property classlist from that element. So here you can see that the property classlist is another object, and that object has functions add, remove, and toggle. So yeah, here we have like food list with the class blue box, and then the class list is a list with just blue box right now because there's only one class. But then you can also add and remove and toggle these classes, and we'll show that in the next few slides. So yeah, here we have, again, like this is what happens when you do class list. What if we want to add another class called dark mode? So this is what happens. Foodlist.classlist.add dark mode essentially like adds the class called dark mode to this class list. So if you print out foodlist.classlist after you've added this new class, it will become an array with an extra element inside with like essentially dark mode added into the list. So assuming that we've like created this CSS class called dark mode in our style sheet, and our style sheet is obviously like properly linked in our HTML, our food list element now has this dark mode style applied to it. Yeah, this is just another like representation of like what it looks like. But yeah. So that's the add functionality for classes. You can also use remove and toggle. So for example, if you want to like remove this dark mode class, you can just call remove, and then that will take it out of this class list array. And so now it'll go back to only having the blue box class. Okay, now I'll try to show like how this works in the browser. Okay, so here we still have like the elements that we've tried to get before. And I'm gonna show like what my style sheet looks like right now. So here I have my index.html file, and then I also linked a style.css file. So within the style.css file, I have the dark mode class, which basically changes the background color to black and then changes the color to white. Okay, so what if we want to add the dark mode class to the food list element? So what we would do is first get the class list property and then use the function add to add that class. And again, like because it already knows that you're adding a class to this list, you don't have to use the period notation to indicate that's a class. You can just use like the string value of that name directly. So let's just say dark mode. Okay, yeah, so you can see that it already changed it on the web page. So like here you can see the background has turned into black and the white or the text has turned into white color. So yeah, that's basically how you would modify any sort of property within, or any sort of CSS property within the web page. You can just add a class that dictates like any changes in your CSS. So if you want to remove this now, we can just call it with remove, and it immediately disappears on the web page. What if we want to do this on an individual list element? Okay, so first we need to define another variable that holds the object which represents the list element. So let's use query selector to get the very first list element that we have in this food list. Yeah, so as you can see here, we successfully retrieved the very first list element. And again, this is kind of like the power of query selector in that even though you have multiple li elements, it only gets the very first one that matches the selector. And the selector here is li. So it picks the very first element that has the li tag. So that's why it returns the list element with meso inside of it. Okay, and let's try to change this so that it's also dark mode. So again, similar to what we did before, we get the class list and then we call the function add onto it. And it has like an autocomplete because we did it before. Yeah, and then here you can see it has automatically changed to the dark mode class. So you can see the background has changed and also the white text. And then again, if we want to remove this, we can just call remove, and then it'll remove that dark mode class. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the programming lecture. So we've covered like how to use document.getElementById and then document.querySelector. And then we also introduced like the concept of objects and like properties and functions within the objects and how you can use them to basically change like the HTML or the CSS properties of different elements on your web page. Does anyone have any questions about this? Okay, if not, I'll just wrap up this part of the lecture. So just to recap, when we think about interactive functionality on our webpage, we can just think of it as like, oh, the user clicks on a certain part of the webpage, whether it be a button or a link or an image, and then they do something to that element, either by changing, adding, or removing the HTML and CSS. And so here, when we try to select an element, we use document.getElementById or document.querySelector to retrieve that object from the DOM. And then we can use the properties and the functions to change and add or remove the HTML and CSS. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Next lecture, we'll put together like all of these different parts of the process, and we'll go more into detail about how to like really like modify and I guess manipulate like CSS and stuff like that with the elements that you get using like document.getElementById and document.querySelector. Are there any final questions? Okay, if not, we'll probably take a 5-minute or so break before we start the design lecture.
Okay, cool. So today we're going to go over some dark design patterns. And I think this topic is super interesting. So I'm super excited to lecture about dark design patterns. And so I guess we can start with this intro video on just like these benches in New York that are supposed to be super uncomfortable. They're not even benches, really. I'll just like skip through the video really quick.
Why are cities full of uncomfortable benches?
So basically the premise of like this video is like there are a lot of like uncomfortable benches in New York City. And so stuff like this, stuff like this. I don't know what other examples they have. Yeah, so like just like another angle of this uncomfortable bench is like that like slanted bench right there. And so they're just like really just leaning bars at that point. And so the reason why New York has so many of these uncomfortable benches is to prevent like homeless people from sleeping on it. And then just to like, it also like decreases the amount of like useful public spaces that there are. So back to the topic of like what we're trying to go for. So how is this related to web design? So here are some terms. So defensive design is the practice of anticipating all possible ways that an end user could misuse a device and then designing the device to make sure that like this misuse is impossible. So in the case of like the New York benches, it's trying to prevent homeless people from sleeping on it. And so in this, like they're trying to prevent homeless people from misusing benches by making them not like sleepable. So yeah, not cool, New York. And on the other hand, there's also dark and unpleasant design, which is a user interface that has been carefully crafted to trick users into doing things, such as buying insurance with their purchase or signing up for recurring bills. So this is like on the opposite end. So instead of preventing someone from doing something, now we're like egging someone on to do something. So I just like I just provided this example of like buying insurance with their purchase. So whenever I like buy concert tickets, the insurance box is always checked. And so if I don't like look closely enough, I'm gonna be spending like $30 extra paying for insurance for these tickets. So that's like dark design. And here's some more terms. So forced continuity is a form of dark design. So this is the idea that like your free trial with the service comes to an end, and then your credit card will keep getting charged for like the service without any warning. And so that's forced continuity. And then we also have bait and switch, which is advertising like a free product. And then after the product is no longer available, they're exposed to other price products similar to the one advertised. So it's like the original product is like free, but like the actual product that you want actually costs money. So here are some bad designs that are kind of like along the lines of like dark design, just to like give you more of an idea of what dark design is. So here we have like you're entering and then it wants to show notifications, and then the allow part comes out first, and then it's just like harder to get to the block notifications. Here is a bit of a clown move for this like flatbread. So they have like this tab here, and then you open it, and then there's this like very much of a scam here. Here's another example. We're like, oh, like the entire bread is probably coated with this like jam, and then you open it and it's really just the edge to like bait you into buying it. So there's that. There's also this, the unsubscribe button is whited out, so you can't like, it's harder to unsubscribe from this email chain. And so that's another example of bad design. And here, you automatically want to like confirm with Touch ID. And then so if you do that, now you're going to be trapped into paying $50 a week starting like April 5th. And so it's free for 3 days. And then it's just like the design, what makes you want to like pay. And so yeah, there's a simple reason why brands employ dark UX tactics. They want to nudge the user towards or away from certain actions in order to drive sales, gather more data, or bump up their email lists. And so when we think about like designing for a business, ultimately they're trying to like promote a certain business model and like make the most money, right? So it makes sense that they're like employing these dark UX tactics, but it's oftentimes not at the benefit of the user. So yeah, now like a lot of the time it's not only annoying to us, but like sometimes it can like go into like even darker territories. And so that's when it raises like ethical concerns. And when it raises ethical concerns, that's when we really start to question these dark design patterns and whether or not these are like just annoying or it's some like leading to something even worse than that. So here's like an example of that. So Instacart is basically has this dark design pattern where their tips are only like 5%. It's like the default tip option is 5% of your purchase. And so the standard for other like grocery delivery apps is like 15 to 20%. And so the fact that Instacart's default option is 5% is really detrimental to the grocery shoppers who are like making these like grocery purchases for you, because it, you know, decreases the amount of tips that they receive, even though they're putting in a lot of work to get your groceries to your door. Here's another example. This was like a few years ago, maybe 2016, I think. Just kidding, 2014. And then, so basically Snapchat had this filter that was of Bob Marley, and it was basically like digital blackface. And a lot of people found it offensive, as they should. And they got a lot of backlash for it and a lot of heat, because like that's not something that like, you know, a like Snapchat filter should be promoting. Here's another example. So also in 2015, Google Photos was blamed for basically having like their image like associating algorithm like associating Black people with gorillas, and it was really bad because it was basically like it was showing like the repercussions of not having a like it shows the repercussions of when a software isn't trained and tested by a diverse group of people. And so yeah, it just showed that they really only tested like their algorithm with like probably like a non-diverse like test group, and that's really bad. And so if you're like interested in this type of stuff, you can like take a look at like this book called Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Noble, I believe. But yeah, the book is definitely called Algorithms of Oppression, and it just talks about like just tech not caring about like diversity and stuff. And another example, yeah, there's a lot of examples of just tech doing bad things, but another example is Facebook's emotional manipulation experiment. And so what happened in this experiment was, as we all know, you know, Facebook's algorithm curates to what we want to see. And so a study basically found that like manipulating the news feed of users could affect the content that those users posted to Facebook. And so like, an example of this was like that the study talked about was like when a user was exposed to more negative content and like more negative news feeds, it led to those users posting more negative status updates. And then when users were exposed to more positive news feeds, it led to more positive statuses. And so yeah, a lot of ethical concerns came up about like Facebook manipulating the emotions of their users. And so like when we really like take a step back and think about it, like big tech companies are operating under a business model, right? And so meaning they don't necessarily have users' well-being as their number one priority, because in order for them to make more money, they need to keep us online for as long as possible. And they do that by curating our news feeds to what like we want to see and like stuff like that, which is why on Facebook you see like your friends posting like or like your friends commenting on stuff and just like things that they think are relevant to you. And in that sense, like they're able to like emotionally manipulate us just by showing us more of like a certain type of content. And so yeah, if you want to like dig a little deeper into this, there's a documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma, which is like a good intro to like all of this. You probably all like heard of it like last semester, I think, when it came out. But yeah, if you haven't watched it, you should definitely check it out if you're interested. So yeah, just from like, and then so what does this mean for designers like us? Like, because we're the ones building these types of things and like designing them from like the like designer standpoint. So as a UX designer, you have a responsibility towards both the brand and the user. It is your job to create unbeatable user experiences that are transparent and unambiguous, making it easier for the user to take the course of action they had indeed set out to take. So yeah, basically just like rewording this, our responsibility as like designers is not only to design things that work, but design things with people's well-being in mind. And so especially because of how much people are like using technology, the things that you design can influence how people think and stuff, and like how people think and interact with each other also. So when we design things, we need to like think beyond the use case that we're designing for, and also think about how people can misuse it or how it can be like detrimental to people. So yeah, as a designer, you like carry a lot of power, and so with that, obviously you like also carry a lot of responsibility as well. Oh no. Okay. Yeah, so just like opening it up to like for discussion, just because I feel like this is super cool. What are some dark design patterns in your own daily interactions that you've noticed? You guys can like drop it in the chat, or just like, yeah. An example that I can think of is like, I guess this isn't like super dark, but like Chipotle puts guac as the first option on their section for toppings. And so it tempts me to spend extra money on guac all the time. Putting additional fees as small like text. Yes, that's really good. Like small text, and like just like even with like signing contracts and stuff, like just like reading the small text anytime you like buy something. No option in Instagram to get rid of notifications meant to lure you in. Yeah, like that's also a good one. Like, so Instagram recently moved like their market like button to like the bottom of their nav bar, which makes it more accessible because like as we talked about, like your thumb is it's easier for your thumb to like touch the bottom of the screen. So the fact that they moved the marketplace to the bottom means that they're trying to egg us on to like engage with the Instagram marketplace more and like our notifications less. Hiding the delete account button on Facebook. Yeah, so all of these things are really good examples of like behaviors that companies want us to like lean towards. Nice. Yeah, and then just like kind of going back to like, I think I touched upon this earlier, but like phones are designed to be addicting. And so this is all just because companies make more money and like get more funding when like the more that we spend on their products. And so obviously phones are designed to be addicting. Like for example, Twitter created like the infinite scroll feature, and so that like keeps you on the app for as long as possible. And now you can see that in like pretty much every social media like app, like Facebook, TikTok, especially like any of these like apps that induce addictive behavior all like follow that infinite scroll pattern, because now you're just like scrolling infinitely and there's no like stopping point. And so yeah, there's this cool like letter to like design students that just like talks like reiterates on our responsibility as designers. And so yeah, definitely take a look at this. It's kind of long, but like I feel like it's a really good read. And it's just like talking about how we should like design with people in mind, and just like making sure that we're not like, you know, designing for like the worst of society and contributing poorly to the world. But yeah, I think that is all for the design lecture. But this is something that's like I'm like super passionate about, so you guys can totally like drop by office hours and talk about it if you want. But yeah, thanks for coming, guys.